Yeah, so the first clue we have is that stuff that was supposed to be left on the moon by Armstrong is actually in his closet here on Earth. The second clue is the Holland Museum moon rock given personally by Armstrong to the prime minister that turns to be out to be petrified wood. And then in 1994, when the space shuttle astronauts get closer to the Van Allen radiation belt, which is this field of radiation that starts above the Earth at about 1,000 miles altitude and extends for about 25,000 miles. And every manned mission in the entire history of space travel has been below that except going to the moon. So when the space shuttle gets to an altitude that's about 640 miles away from it, they can see the radiation with their eyes closed as sparks of light hitting it. And CNN issues the report that says this word for word. The radiation belt surrounding the Earth is more dangerous than previously believed. Well, what is previously believed? That's the Apollo missions, who were in the middle of the radiation for an hour to the moon and for an hour coming back. So how is it that space shuttle astronauts who are 640 miles away from the radiation can know more about it than astronauts who went through it? Now, you can also see on my YouTube channel, which is linked at Sibrel.com, this Orion project that came out in December of last year. They have their own NASA video and this 20-ish guy engineer saying that
Kelly.
they must, that's right. Kelly Smith, he says, we must first learn how to protect astronauts from the dangerous radiation of the Van Allen radiation belt before we can send people through this region of space. So he's basically admitting that the Apollo astronauts did not go through it because he's saying the technology to protect astronauts from this radiation does not yet exist. It's an admission that they did not go to the moon. I called the press department. I say, I want to talk to the guy. No, he doesn't give interviews anymore. Yeah, I can see why. And then not only that, I say, well, why don't you give me these guys? They had two different Geiger counters. The Orion mission went up and it went to exactly 3,600 miles and came back. Now, if you go to the grocery store and then come back home, what's your destination? The grocery store. So if they go to 3,600 miles and then U-turn, what's their destination? Whatever's at 3,600 miles. It's the radiation belt. That's why they have two Geiger counters on board. They need to know the radiation of that belt. So I said, well, why don't you send me those Geiger counter readings? And they said, no, it's a classified secret. And I said, wait a minute here. You're telling me that something like the temperature of the sun or how much hydrogen is in Jupiter's atmosphere is a secret? It's just a part of nature. Why would the amount of radiation in a part of space be a national secret? They said I had to file a Freedom of Information Request Act in order to get those readings. And I said, you got to be kidding me. Now, this is completely absurd. There's no reason for a measurement of nature to be a secret unless it would prove that the moon landings are fake, and that's why it's a national secret. So what can you do? I mean, even these 20-ish people are basically suggesting directly, or they're figuring it out, but they don't want to get fired. So they're hinting at the radiation belts prevent people from leaving Earth orbit. I mean, they're saying so. They say we cannot yet send people through this region of space. Then how did they do it with 1960s technology? I mean, Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, I believe it was 1927. Now, to say it would be 50 years before anybody on Earth from any nation, including the one that did it 50 years earlier, it would be 50 years before another person flew across the Atlantic. That's just not the case. When Columbus sailed to the New World, it was like the following year. Everyone was sailing to the New World. When Lewis and Clark went west, it was the following year. Everyone went, west. When the Wright brothers achieved powered flight, it was weeks later that other people around the world were achieving powered flight. To say that we could go to the moon on our first attempt with 1960s technology, and it cannot be repeated by any nation on Earth 50 years later? I mean, China, the most industrialized country on Earth, says it's going to take twice the amount of time as it did in the 1960s to develop the technology to reach the moon. It's totally absurd. The South Pole, has 100 to 200 mile per hour winds. It's below 100 degrees minus Fahrenheit there. And yet there are bases there. Why? Because it's humanly possible. If it were humanly possible to go to the moon in the 1960s, there would be bases there by now.
But look at everything that's discovered. First, perhaps used by the military or its technology, then it becomes commercialized. I cannot believe that after almost 50 years, we haven't commercialized trips to the moon. By now, we should have hotels. We should have cameras pointing to the Earth from the moon. And none of that has happened.
Well, look at Branson. All he was trying to do, he's a very smart guy, and he was just trying to achieve low Earth orbit, and he killed his crew. And NASA, the last 2 times they and the military tried to achieve Earth orbit outside of the space shuttle, they blew up. So if they can't go 200 miles above the Earth today, how could they land on another planet and play golf in the 1960s? It is completely illogical. The problem we have here, Mel, is this is the only crime you could say, or conspiracy, whatever word you want to use, that is positive. I mean, whoever shot Kennedy, he's still dead. Whoever did 9/11, 3,000 people are still dead. But the moon landing is a positive lie. And it's like me telling you your favorite football team that just won the Super Bowl, well, they cheated. You know, they drugged the other team or they changed the score. You don't want to hear it. You're ready to punch me in the face for saying such a despicable thing. But what if it's true? The problem is people want to hear.
And you were punched in the face a few times, right?
Well, that's true. The fact is, if I walked on the moon and someone else thought otherwise, I would find that hysterical. That would be like throwing a feather at me. Why would I be mad for someone throwing a feather at me? If someone said, well, you swear in a Bible that you walked on the moon, and I did, I'd say, sure. I swear in a stack of Bibles. Are you okay? But the fact is, it would be like walking up to a man in front of his wife and saying, well, how's your girlfriend doing? That would make him mad because I'm revealing a truth that he wants suppressed.
But let's stay, I don't mean to interrupt you. Let's stay with the Van Allen belt for a moment because this is puzzling and it makes you wonder how dumb they think we are to not notice. And I've also seen interviews with NASA personnel where they're saying they're designing new spacesuits so that the astronauts can withstand going through the Van Allen belt. Anyone with a bit of brain, Bart, should question this. How is it that they're coming up with these spacesuits now when allegedly astronauts have been going through the Van Allen belt since 1969? I mean, take astronaut Alan Bean. You interviewed him, right? The 4th person to allegedly walk on the moon on November 69. He said he wasn't sure we went far enough out to encounter the Van Allen belt. Maybe we did. Then when you said the belt is 1,000 to 25,000 miles out, he said, then we went through it. But he basically said we hadn't discovered it then.
Yeah, he was kind of doing doublespeak. He wasn't even aware that he went through the Van Allen belts. I pointed out that the space shuttle can see the radiation from 640 miles away, and you're in the middle of it. You didn't have that effect. And he said, well, yeah. You know, after the fact, I said, but it wasn't reported at that time until 1994. And he said, yeah, but it hadn't been discovered. So he said he saw him, then he didn't see him. He said he went through the belt, but then he said he didn't. Can't really make up his mind. The guy also said, you know, during the alleged descent to the moon, it's super quiet. And he, you know, you can hear Neil Armstrong or whoever saying, you know, we're 100 feet away, 90 feet away, and it's dead quiet in the background. And he said, well, that's because the vacuum of space, which they use for a catch-all excuse for all the lies that are pointed out, that because of that, you can't hear the engine. But then again, Eugene Cernan, he says, oh, it's very loud while you're descending to the moon. Well, it's the same equipment. One of it's loud and the other time it's dead quiet.
Well, 2 things. The Van Allen belt was discovered in 1958. You would think that an astronaut, the 4th person to walk on the moon, would be well-versed on that if he's going to be going through it.
It's amazing. Most people who adamantly believe that the moon landing is real will not entertain for 1/100th of a second that the moon missions were fake. They're like gaga over it. They worship it. In fact, during the launch, you can hear people say, my God. Well, that's it exactly. the overflowing of the heart, the mouth speaks. It is their God. They are brainwashed by Star Trek, which preceded it by a couple of years, that, traveling around the world and all the universe is, as easy as microwaving a burrito. And so surely we can walk on the moon if they can do that. It was, who knows if that was predictive programming or what. It's so simple. If they can go to the moon with 1960s technology, and I can buy a watch from Walmart for $10 that has 100 times the computing power as that rocket, then they could go today, but they cannot do it. That is so crystal clear that they didn't go. Not to mention the fact that I have photographic evidence of them faking a shot right in front of your eyes, and a funny thing happened on the way to the moon, and audio. According to NASA, there's only 2 people on this channel because it's a public, channel funded by the taxpayers. It's not a military project. It's done for the, scientific purposes. There's NASA on the channel, and there's the astronauts on the channel. Wrong. At the beginning of the clip, and you can play it if you'd like, you hear NASA saying, hey, the TV picture looks great. There's exactly 4 seconds of dead air. Then you hear a third party that's crystal clear, no radio, interference, and it says, talk. And then Neil Armstrong starts speaking. Now, at first I thought, well, he was preoccupied with this, special effect shot they were doing, and they were reminding him, to talk. Actually, after the film was produced, I realized he's only about 200 miles above the Earth. And so, according to, time delay, there really isn't one. He can hear NASA immediately, and they can hear him immediately. However, if he's halfway to the moon, 130,000 miles out, it would take time for the radio signal to go there, come back, and be processed through all that equipment and satellites around the world. It'd be about a 4-second delay. So had he answered the question immediately, it would give away the fact that he's really much closer to the Earth than he claimed to be. So that's why someone in the CIA was counting off 4 seconds on a stopwatch. He had a private earpiece in. After he heard NASA, 4 seconds go by, you hear talk. And then Neil Armstrong starts speaking to create that fake radio delay to give the impression he's further away from the Earth than he really is. That's on the tape too. In fact, 4 out of 5 people who watch a funny thing happen on the way to the moon reverse their opinion as to the authenticity of the moon missions, largely because of this newly discovered unedited footage of outtakes from the mission of them faking a shot right in front of your eyes. It's not a theory. It's not a theory that we didn't go to the moon. It is prior to this footage being uncovered. It's a fact. You can see it and hear it with your own eyes and ears.
But even today, before we started, I was talking to my wife, and she's not into any of these topics. She believes that we went to the moon. She thinks, well, that's okay. But I said, all right, so you believe we went to the moon. It's been 50 years almost, and we haven't commercialized it. And she actually paused and said, that's the most compelling thing I've ever heard. You may be onto something.
Theoretically, you could go to the moon if you had enough protection from the radiation, but we're talking at least a foot of lead around the entire spacecraft. And then, according to von Braun, once you landed on the moon, in his original writings, you would have to immediately go into a cave in the moon, if you could find one, to protect yourself from micrometeorites. Meteorites, I don't know how many hit the Earth every day, but I'm sure it's in the tens of thousands of falling stars, little sparks in the sky. They burn up before they hit the Earth because of the atmosphere and the friction thereof. However, on the moon, you don't have atmosphere. So all those tens of thousands of meteorites are hitting the moon every single day. And if you have a meteorite only the size of a grain of sand, that thing is traveling anywhere from 15,000 to 25,000 miles per hour. And it's going to go through your brain and through your space suit or spacecraft and cause decompression. And it's going to kill you. In fact, von Braun said there would be a 50% chance of a catastrophic failure because of a micrometeorite on the moon every 48 hours. And then he completely recanted on that. In fact, he said to reach the moon initially, you would need 3 rockets, not 1, and each rocket would have to be about 40 times bigger than the Apollo spacecraft. In fact, he recanted on his math by a factor of more than 30,000% when Kennedy set the goal to go to the moon. Now, number one, how can you trust a guy who is that far off on his math? Or it seems like he's making some sort of political correctness change here. I mean, after all, Kennedy was not a scientist. He was a visionary politician. We went up into space for 15 minutes. We went from the East Coast to the West Coast, didn't even orbit the whole Earth. 3 days later, the guy says, hey, let's make a goal to go to the moon before the end of the 1960s, December 31st, 1969. We allegedly met that goal within 5%. What happened is it proved to be an impossibility. He was killed. Johnson took over. Of course, he's from Texas, and all that NASA money is in Houston. Mm-hmm. And out of all the presidents who were eligible to run for re-election as an incumbent in the entire history of the country, there was only 2 who chose not to, one of which is Johnson, because he knew they were going to fake the moon landing. Now, who knew that would work? It might work. It might not work. And if it didn't work and you got caught when you were president, what a legacy that would be. It would be worse than Nixon. And so he chose not to run so he would not have to deal with that hot potato. Then Nixon comes in, tricky dick. And you have to understand there's no independent press coverage. People say, well, there are 100,000 people involved in NASA. That's true. But there are 150,000 people involved in building the atomic bomb in 1944. And yet they didn't know what they were building. One person built the switch, another person built this, that, and the other. It's completely departmentalized to keep it a secret. You really think they're going to tell the guy building the glove or the door of the boot, hey, the moon landings are fake, but don't tell anybody. Give me a break. The thing is like a pyramid, and only the people at the very top know what is going on. They go up, and then there's only 3 eyewitnesses. 3. I mean, people say, oh, whether you deny the Holocaust. Of course not. World War II was done on Earth in front of 1 billion eyewitnesses. But each moon landing only had 3 eyewitnesses controlled by the government, and there's no independent press coverage, right? There's all sorts of independent press coverage of World War II, but who can go to the moon? Who can go to outer space? We just assumed, because we trusted Nixon, that these pictures, television, were coming from the moon, but they're just coming from the government. They can say whatever they want to say. You know, the idea that this alleged new lunar, orbiter taking a picture of the surface and have these little shadows or scratches, it's amazing that people think this is proof that the moon landings are fake. And I'm thinking, wait a minute. Nearly 50 years ago, they faked a full body picture standing on the moon's surface of an astronaut. So you don't think they can fake little scratches or shadows on a lunar satellite picture 50 years later with Photoshop? I mean, come on. It's like asking a criminal to provide his own proof of his own guilt. Do you really think he's going to do that? I mean, it's absurd. It says, well, go to nasa.gov and you can see all the proof of the moon landings being real. Really?
What about the Clementine mission? Why haven't we seen more? Only 10% of the images we've seen.
Well, one interesting thing is that NASA now says that all of the lunar landing sites are off limits, that you cannot go there. You physically can't send a rover there or whatever. Well, that's pretty convenient, isn't it? You cannot, according to China, they are banned from sending a rover to the Apollo 11 landing site, which could theoretically, prove that there's nothing there, because there is nothing there. And China, unfortunately, is kind of in bed with the United States. They're not going to call our BS, and we're not going to call theirs. I mean, they have most favored nation trading status, even though they run over their own citizens with tanks when they want to have a democracy. I mean, is that a little contradictory or what? So they know, in fact, they teach in college, high school, and elementary school in China that the moon landings are fake. They never say it publicly. That's just what they do in their own country. I've talked to Russians, and they say the only people who think the moon landings are real are the brainwashed Americans, because of the propaganda they're constantly fed. Every year, History Channel comes up, with Apollo moon missions are great. Well, here's something. The Saturn V rocket, all the schematics and engineering and blueprints, as well as the lunar module, they say, well, none of that's classified. They're just not available. We destroyed them. Now, if you had made this great invention of something that flawlessly lands on the moon on the first attempt and comes back and can somehow, with a bank of car batteries, compete with air conditioning against 250 degrees outside for 3 days nonstop, I think I would want to save, the millions and billions of dollars worth of engineering, designs, and schematics on that. But they were deliberately destroyed so that you could not later prove that it's simply impossible to power air conditioning against 250 degrees on the spanking car batteries for more than, probably an hour. And then it would probably only get down to about 190 degrees. So all this stuff you could prove. You could prove the Saturn V didn't have enough fuel to have escape velocity, but they've destroyed all the, original diagrams of it. And of course, they also destroyed all the every single original TV image of every moon mission got accidentally lost. Now, they have a copy or the original of the Constitution, and which is 237 years old, the Declaration of Independence and all these things, but they can't keep videotapes of the most important event in the country's history. They lose them. I've estimated that this is about 1 to 2 tons worth of videotapes, and they lost it. And then the only VCR that can play back these one-of-a-kind formatted tapes, they deliberately disassembled and destroyed the parts so that if the tapes are found in the future, you can't ever watch them anyway. In fact, poor Ron Howard, who was so gaga over Apollo, even though his own grandfather told him that the moon missions were fake and he ignored him, he had this IMAX 70 millimeter, extravaganza 10, 20 years ago about the moon landings and all they're great. Watch the movie. 90% of it are reenactments because there's so little original footage from the missions. And then some of them, of this huge IMAX screen, is this little box about 10% inside, and you can see a VHS tracking line. You know why? Because the footage was so hard to come by, he rented it from Blockbuster just like I did. I can see the VHS tracking line, and it's because of him that the tapes got lost anyway, because he called up NASA and he said, what we've got is fourth generation, a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy, and I want the originals, and I want to do all digital transfers, and I want it to be seen in the highest detail possible. They said, I'll get back with you. And when they got back with him, all the tapes were lost. Thank you, Ron Howard.